Okay, hi everyone. Let's continue with planning the SOC 2 examination strategy. What does it mean? First, important of planning the examination. Why effective planning matters? Because it ensures the engagement is carried out effectively and efficiently, help the auditor identify potential challenges earlier, and also enable proper team coordination, task allocation, as well as oversight. For example, efficient planning helps allocate more resources to areas with higher risks, such as testing security measures if previous reports indicated vulnerabilities, right? Key aspect to address, we have scope, timing, and direction. Clearly define the scope, determine timing, and set the direction for the examination or SOC 2 examination. Step to define the strategy, understand services and requirements, get a clear understanding of what services the organization offer and the service use. Even you as an entity users, that's an important thing. You need to understand what kind of service is it. It's very, very important. That's why we spend so much time talking about the system in description, how if it's integrated with other system, if they have like sub-service organization, but you need to have a good understanding on those. Okay. As an example, if the organization provides cloud storage, the auditor needs to understand data availability and protection commitments. Communication plan, determine when to communicate key findings and on updates during their process, right? As an example, setting regular check-ins with stakeholders to keep them informed of progress, recognize significant factors that will direct the engagement, such as risk area or previous finding, identify the methods and sources of evidence to support the examination, right? Then let's see areas that we can consider factor to guide engagement strategy. You have past experience. Previous engagement experience can help focus effort on area previously identified at high risk or needing more attention, especially if no change have occurred. That's something that is worth considering. If prior audits identify security concern, the auditor will plan to test those areas thoroughly also, right? Timing and resources, ensure enough time and resources are allocated for testing and also reviewing all key areas. What of ongoing adaptation of the plan? Iterative process. Planning is ongoing and should be adjusted based on new findings or change in the service organization. As an example, if the service organization updates its security protocol midway through the audit, the auditor may need to adjust the strategy to account for these changes as well, right? So suppose a company previous security audit revealed vulnerabilities in their encryption system, the auditor will plan to allocate extra time and resources to testing these security measures during the current audit, right? But let's look at planning consideration for using the inclusive method with self-service organization. Remember, we had covered this already previously when we started. We'll talk about complexity and all those things. But what are some of the challenges? The inclusive method can be complex and may not always be feasible, especially when multiple service organizations are involved. Requires extensive coordination and communication between the service auditor, service organization, as well as the sub-service organization, like three talks together. So if a service organization uses multiple sub-service organizations, the auditor must clarify which ones are intended or included in the audit and which are excluded. And this is very, very important, especially if it's an inclusive, right? If it's like inclusive method, organization, say you have the SOC 2 report as the report user or entity, you are analyzing the SOC 2 report, then you realize that the auditors or the report, the service organization have a lot of sub-service organization. How you go about it? I'd like to know in the comment section, how will you even intend, because those are things that you're going to see. Because remember, at the end of the day, they have like 4 or 5 or 6. You need to know who amongst the self-service organization has control over your data. I would like to know more of a critical thinker. What are you going to do in that situation? I would like to know in the comment section, because that's some of the things that you're going to find when you are reviewing a SOC 2 Type 2 report, right? Coordination and agreement. Before using the inclusive method, both the service organization and sub-service organization agreed on using the inclusive method. First, scoping and timing. Agreed on the period cover and the scope of the audit. Assertion and representation. Subservice organization must provide written assertion and representation letters to the auditor. Content of the description. Both organizations need to agree on the content and format of the system description. As an example, if a cloud service provider uses an external security provider, both parties need to confirm how the security provider system will be included in the report, right? Key responsibility of subservice organization management. First, they want to provide evidence if it has to do with an inclusive method. Remember, they'll need to be able to provide those evidence to show that their controls are operational. And it says subservice organization management is responsible for providing the service auditor with relevant information such as records, reports, as well as internal audits, right? What of the implementation? And they need to also make sure that controls, as I said, has been implemented and have been effective or operational. What of a situation where there are any deficiency? So you also want to make sure that those deficiencies should be disclosed to the auditors, right? Maybe it has to do with an issue in non-compliance. It could be fraud. It could be any impairment in service commitment. So irrespective of the fact that you are a sub-service organization, once you've agreed to be included, to be part of that inclusive method testing, then you should be transparent and provide whatever information that the auditor might request. As an example, a subservice organization must disclose any non-security breaches or compliance failures that could affect the service organization system description. What of handling issue with inclusive method? If the subservice organization refuses to provide a written assertion, the service organization cannot use the inclusive method, but might switch Carve-Out. Do you see? If they refuse it, because again, remember what we spoke last time, maybe due to, other privacy concern, maybe they'll sign, it can be very, very, very chaotic, dealing with all these cloud services providers and products. So in that situation, then you might want to go in with a Carve-Out, meaning that, the auditors will not access their controls. But if they are going out with a Carve-Out method, remember you as a user entity, what are those things when you are reviewing, depending on the criticality and sensitivity of your data, how do you also intend to perform due diligence? I would like to know in the comment section. The auditor needs to assess whether it is feasible to obtain sufficient evidence for the subservice organization portion of the audit. As an example, if the subservice organization is unwilling to participate fully in the audit, the service organization might need to adjust the approach using the Carve-Out method instead of inclusive method. But what of the subservice assertion? Scope of the assertion. First, the subservice organization assertion typically include confirming, just like the service organization, subservice will also need to do that if it has to do with inclusive method. Description of the services they provided to the service organization and users, suitability of their design controls, operational effectiveness of their control as it pertains to the SOC 2 Type 2 examination. Say, if a service organization manages user authentication services, the assertion would, that's subservice organization, their assertion will confirm the description of the service and the effectiveness of their access control system. Because now we start talking about like shared control, hybrid control, controls, remember? So we also want to test their own piece or effectiveness of their controls. But what of talking of performing risk assessment procedure for SOC 2? One, we want to talk of understanding the system and the controls. What are some of those key steps in risk assessment? Service auditor must first and foremost understand the organization system. Remember, everything starts from the level of the system. How those controls are being designed under the SOC 2 Type 2 examination, and then the operational effectiveness of those controls. And in the purpose section, to identify and assess risks of material misstatement and design procedure that respond to these risks to form an opinion on the control. because at the end of the day, you want to do it to be able to see if those control pass or those control fail. In as much as the service organization must have provided a written assertion confirming and telling you that everything that you're going to be doing works, it doesn't apply like that. And that's why, remember, we talk about modification, extension, and all those other things, right? Say, for example, if an organization implements security controls for customer data, the auditor must evaluate the design and effectiveness of those controls in protecting sensitive data, right? Understanding the service organization system. So, scope of the understanding, the auditor must gather enough knowledge to assess the service organization system and related controls effectively. But what to understand, you have to understand the system boundaries. What part of the system are included in the audit and how they interact with other systems. Which controls are necessary to meet service commitment and system requirements. If a service provider is responsible for both data storage and processing, the auditor needs to understand how both areas are secured and controlled as well, right? Then assessing the description of the system, you want to evaluate the system description, where the auditors need to determine whether the description provided by the service organization clearly reflect the system design and implemented. And these are all things that we've covered already. And what are some of the areas where they're going to focus on? If you look here, we have some words that are being bold-marked, right? Being bold, rather written in bold. Whether the system is described as it actually is, and if it meets the description criteria, assess whether the controls are suitable for achieving the organization goals. Remember what I just said earlier? Yes, organization can give you this system description. They can come up with their assertion, their written assertion, but still, that's not enough tangible reason for you to just trust them. That's why we're talking about independence, firm, that again, you still have to make sure that those controls are suitable so as to achieve the organization's goal. And in the case of a type 2 report, you want to determine if the control were operating effectively during that period, over a period of time, right? So a company describes their data encryption method. The auditor assesses if this encryption method is suitable to protect data and whether it was consistently applied during the review period. Understanding internal control as well as internal audit. What does that mean? Auditors should understand how the service organization management ensures that the description of its system is accurate and complete, how the organization identify its services, commitment, and system requirements, how management evaluated the design as well as effectiveness of controls. As an example, management might review the internal controls over data privacy to ensure compliance with regulations like GDPR or CCPA. Auditors will evaluate how these controls are addressed and if they function as intended. Okay? What of a situation where you have to bring in specialists to help with your internal team? Maybe your internal auditors do not really knowledgeable, still struggling to understand how this is being performed. And that's why you said understanding the role of the internal auditors. So the auditor should inquire whether the service organization use any specialist for preparing description or evaluating controls. If the organization has an internal audit functions, auditors should understand what activities internal auditor perform related to the systems. Key findings of internal audits regarding controls, right? As an example, if an organization using a specialist to assess the control of a cloud infrastructure, the auditor needs to understand the specialist findings and how those findings relate to service commitment and system requirement. Even you as working internally, you collaborated with different stakeholders, you assess those controls. So those findings, when control fails, control pass, that's something that, you guys can also relate or, let the auditors know. So what's the takeaway? It says service auditor must gather sufficient understanding of the service organization system and controls to assess risks and design the audit procedures. If the organization has an internal audit function or use specialists, The auditors must also review their involvement and findings to ensure all relevant controls are considered. Cloud service provider uses a third-party security firm to assess its data protection methods. The service auditor will review the security firm's report, understand the firm's finding, and determine whether these controls were adequately designed and operated during the audit period. So with that, we will continue with a description of system as well as preparation process. What does that mean? Having discussed all of those, I will definitely see you guys in the next video. Okay.